Okay, well, I think we're good to go. Well, hey, everybody. I think we're live, and I am excited to be here doing my first official kind of like teaching live stream where we dive into what is sexual addiction, what is the Christian path of recovery, what does that look like, why is that any different than a normal path of recovery? And this is going to be a drop zone, a place to launch from for anybody who's wanting to begin this process. What I find very frequently is that people who are in need of recovery, in need of sexual addiction, addressing sexual addiction, they don't really have language for that. They don't really know, like, how bad the problem is, might be one of the ways, or like how disturbing it actually is on their lives, or what it looks like on the other side. They don't have a concept of how the grass might be greener on the other side. They don't even know. As a matter of fact, I would say that part of my story was accepting a sort of Christianity that was secondary, that was second, that was not as good, like not what the promise is in faith. So I'm excited to get into this and be able to, hopefully just help out. And today my credentials are just a guy who's gone through it. Those are my credentials. So, a lot of this will be kind of from me to you, if that makes sense. And I hope that it's helpful. So, right up front, I just want to say that obviously, welcome to you, but also this is about Christian sexual addiction. And one of the reasons that's important is because I am expecting that people who are listening to this might have some, well, just level of wanting to be like Christ, just some level of wanting to grow in their relationship with God, and to have a Christian framework in general. I know that that can mean a lot of different things, but for today, it's going to be just a grounding point for us, and a place for us to jump from. And also, I work with Christians almost exclusively in this area. And so, frankly, Christians have a beautiful path to freedom in Christ. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So, the purpose of this live stream is, like I said, a launching point. If you're struggling or wondering how to address unwanted sexual behaviors, that's what it's about. And my name's Devon. My hope for you, what I really want to do is give you just that little step forward, that little bit forward, that little bit of understanding in order to get the ball rolling for you. I want you to know Christ and the power of His grace. And if I can move that across the table, if somehow you can receive the grace of Jesus, then I've done my job for sure. I also want to just say that this is freedom. On the other side is freedom, and we're looking to take over this fleshly thing and submit it to Christ so that we can have a sense of actual free will. We're not being driven to things. No. We're not doing the things we don't want to do. We're doing the things we want to do. And I know. That doesn't mean there's no temptation or anything. That doesn't mean that, we become superhuman or something like that. What it does mean is that we become more than conquerors. Those who can choose to deny themselves, pick up their cross, and follow Christ. So, let's dive into this a little bit. You should know I have a business called Warfare of Grace. I'm a pastoral counselor. The Warfare of Grace itself exists to redeem men from sexual addiction into spiritual leadership through the biblical warfare of grace. I also work with couples and ladies who have husbands that are struggling, or partners who are struggling with sexual addiction. I like to interpret there. So we're going to start, though, by telling my story. So let's get off the ground here with telling my story so you know kind of where I'm coming from. Like I said, today I'm a guy who's gone through it before, and hopefully you can glean from that. So a quick warning about stories and telling my story. The warning's this: a lot of times in the Christian community, we get into kind of this like everything was bad and now everything is good model. And while I definitely believe that there was a lot wrong, that doesn't mean all was wrong. And while a ton is right, I'm not like done or in perfect shape or anything like that. It's it's a beautiful growth process, and it's been very rewarding in a lot of ways that I could never have imagined. Also, my phone's going off. Y'all now know my text noise. Haha, early live stream problems. Um, but what I want to extract from the storytelling, that idea that we're going to go from and life was horrible, and I was doing drugs, and I was having sex, and I was doing all these bad things, and then God came and changed everything. That's not really what we're talking about. He did change everything. I have a whole new perspective, but we're not talking about the kind of Disneyland flip flop that doesn't fit into reality very well. We're talking about something else. So I've got a 7-minute timer for myself to tell my story, because I could talk for a long time about myself. I'm sorry about that. But well, let's dive into my story here real quick. And timer on. Okay, so I grew up as a pastor's kid, but I wasn't always a pastor's kid. My father was in technology. My mother stayed home for the most part, and also when we lived on a farm for a little while, so she did a kennel and that sort of thing. And my life was basically characterized by about the first 8 years, relatively uneventful, very nurturing, very loving family. Come from a strong kind of structured household, strong Christian household. And at 8 years old, I ran into trauma just headlong. I was abused as a child multiple times by people not directly related to me, but nearby. And that began a process of kind of hiding. And when I finally revealed that those things had happened to me, there was this huge sense of destruction, a huge sense of how I had brought shame on the family and feelings like this. And I remember a few instances where along the way, where I took on the weight of and the kind of the burden of what these people had done to me. Now, that being said, directly after feeling that weight come on me and not having a lot of good ways to handle what I was dealing with, on the back end of that came pornography. And pornography just kind of dovetailed onto all those feelings and became a full-blown addiction by the time I was 12 years old, 11, 12 years old. The internet, the advent of the internet had happened. I'm just young enough to be in that category of people who had all their access at their fingertips. And that was definitely a huge part of my story. It became something that I struggled with over and over and over and over again. What was crazy is that as I had this side of me, as many of you who might struggle with sexual addiction know, you've got one side of you that keeps doing this wrong thing. And then the other side of you is doing really good things. In my case, I was doing all I could in the youth group. I had, developing friendships and developing character and growing up. And in many ways, it looked very, very good. And it was very good in a lot of ways. As a matter of fact, as I got into my college years, I went to college and originally was a philosophy major, get that. And then I turned into a youth ministry major, because when I got to college, very quickly, I was invited to be a part of leading at a church in youth ministry. And as I engaged with that, it was oh man, it was awesome. And it was right up my alley. I was really, really good about it and passionate for it and that sort of thing. And during that time, I struggled with this stuff, just struggled and struggled and struggled and struggled. And probably the longest I went, I'd had seasons without interacting with pornography, kind of like the go to CIY, get real passionate, get 2 to 4 weeks of purity. But then I'd be right back in the mire. And what I didn't realize is I was handling my problems that way and generating this rhythm of medication. There's all sorts of other pieces in there. I had multiple other abuse encounters and just a lot of legalistic pain in the structures of my faith and stuff like that. But as I got into ministry, because I loved Jesus, man. As I got into ministry, God was faithful. And that's one of the things that I want to let you know, and I want to encourage you with from my story, is that God was faithful. And yet, even as God was faithful, I could see something was wrong with me, even though I didn't know exactly what it was. I could see something was wrong with me because God was being faithful, but I continued to decline. And my decline was this internal, just whirlwind tornado of fire and hurt, and it felt very intense. And because of my traumatic experiences, there was a lot of intense kind of reactionary stuff going on with me. And yeah, and so as it happens, what was going on with me came out to the church, and I lost a lot, man. I lost at that point, pretty much lost everything. Lost a job, lost relationships, lost tons of friends, lost my uh, you know relationship with my family for a time. Just everything was shaken all at once. My dad being a pastor, his whole world was affected, and my brother's worlds, and I come from a large family, so everyone there was affected, and obviously all the kids I had cared for and tended to, and everyone was affected, and it was a big explosion. um, and at the same time, even though it was like an explosion, it was also like a just an absolute stillness occurred, and it felt like every eye just went onto me. And man, that hurt. I've never hurt like that. I have never hurt like that. I remember one night after everything came out, and I'll just be honest with you guys, it was more than just pornography, okay? But this isn't the time and place for going all the way in. Um, I remember coming home one night, and my whole family, like my brothers and my mom, and my dad, and some of their wives, were all in my house. And I come in, and I can't even make it past the kitchen, and I just just ended up laying on the floor, just weeping, and uh, man, it sucked. Oh my gosh, it sucked. Major pain. And in the wake of that, I made a decision, probably the best decision I've ever made. I made the decision to run to Christ instead of remain where I was. And I believe at this point in my life that that fallout was a right consequence and a God ordained thing to bring me where I am today, which I'm thankful for. I wish I hadn't had to go through it, but I'm thankful for it. Um, Very soon after that, I started pursuing healing. I found groups to be a part of. I got counsel, and I have just been deeply invested in healing and recovery. And God has returned to me lots of gifts. Oh, there's our timer. So let me wrap it up with this. Um, Great little story. Along the way, there was one day where in my addiction, I had felt very just numb all the time. Gotten to the place where it felt like I was always um, just like this. Like I couldn't engage with the universe. Things didn't impact me. Things didn't affect me like they should. I felt numb. And so there was one day where, about 6 months into healing, where I'm worshiping God and still feeling this numbness, this blandness. And suddenly I can feel the Holy Spirit. I can feel God descending upon me, melting away my strongholds and just resting upon me. And what was crazy about it is that on one level, I was just overjoyed that God and His presence was upon me. Then on another level, I was just so embarrassed and so hurt. Like all I could say to God is, God, don't leave, don't leave, don't leave, don't leave, don't leave. Because it's convicting. It's convicting to hang out with God. When you spend time with Him, you realize how depraved you are. So, but in that moment, I was able to truly worship again, connecting to God and worshiping. And that kind of worship had been stolen from me by addiction. So that's kind of my story. And since then, I've gone on a journey of healing and recovery and learning and all those things. And uh, in the process of getting back into some education and that sort of thing, was called into doing helping other men with this stuff. So that's what I do now. Is I help men all the time work through their sexual addiction issues, and come to, in my opinion, come to a deep, loving relationship with Jesus that is free from shame, but full of the conviction to play the man and step up to the call of Christ. So there's so much more there that I could talk about, but now you know just a little bit about me. I do want to say that still married to my awesome wife and have 6 beautiful children, and things are going really well there. Okay, so that's my story. But let's actually get into sexual addiction now a little bit. Here's some things um, we are to be righteous. There's a lot of talk about this, and a lot of like, is it grace or judgment? And people often put biblical standards into this kind of paradigm where it's like grace and judgment don't fit together. They're really opposing things. And I suppose that as Christian communities, sometimes we can fall into those categories broadly as a whole community. And I get that. But if we're being really honest with Scripture, we know that when we come to Christ, we are to become righteous on some level. We're supposed to become like him, and he was certainly righteous. And in First Peter, it says, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree that we might die to sin and live to righteousness, right? Like there's we become righteous, and then we are working to be more righteous through the process of sanctification. And that's where Christian sexual addiction sits. In my opinion, for the most part, it doesn't sit in the realm of saved or not saved, but rather in the area of sanctified and not sanctified. Now, we can get into an awful lot of conversation, maybe some other time, about what it looks like to pursue sin to the point of a threat to our salvation, which I think is a very real conversation. But in the case of what we're talking about here right now, this sin is not threatening our salvation, but rather convicting us unto repentance, and that is where we turn our attention to a repentance and sanctification, become looking more like Christ. So let's talk about a few components of sexual addiction. I don't know about you. I'm a little more of like a technical thinker. I like to kind of put things in order and stuff like that. So we won't be like feeling around too much today. We'll be kind of technical. So today we're going to look through kind of a classic lens that you'll probably relate to, and it's the body, mind, and spirit lens, right? We've got these different parts of ourselves. We've got our mind, we've got our body, and then we've got our spirit. And we're going to go through those and just talk about some implications in each of these areas. Let's start with the body. So how does the body participate in sexual sin? Well, obviously, I mean, we know that sexual sin in general is a bodily act, although we do know that Jesus also talks about it being a mental act. We can commit adultery in our heart, so to speak, by lusting after someone in our mind. So how does the body participate in sexual sin? Well, it's important up front that we recognize that if you have an addiction to sexual sin, then that addiction is not about sex. This is a classic addiction concept, which is our addictions are not about the thing. They're about the thing under the thing. They're about the things that drive that answer. So if you think of addiction like having a need for medication, it's like you have a problem in your life and you're solving that problem with the medication of whatever your addiction is. And it's no different for sexual sin or sexual compulsion. So the body participates in this, in the fact that it develops these systems that drive in bodily experience, that drive the pursuit of that medication. So in doing so, we develop a way to cope with life as it is experienced in the body. So let's talk about the root of that. So in the root of our experience, we experience fear. And that fear is rooted in our mind for sure. You're going to see there's crisscross between all these different parts, between the body, mind, and spirit for sure. But the fear is actually experienced in the body. And a lot of times we could call these fears our triggers, right? We're triggered in fear. You've probably heard that term before. And then there's a sort of driver. And that driver, that thing that pushes forward the fear in our body, we're going to call that trauma right now. What I really mean is it's this structure of beliefs that have been formed out of our past experiences that drive forward the need for the medication, whatever it is. And then we experience from those things. Oh man, we experience anger and anxiety and hopelessness and depression. We have driven mentalities. We have like a tornado brain. I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way. I like to use the term tornado brain, right? Where my mind just can't settle, and I'm worried, maybe I'm freaking out, however you want to say it. Maybe I'm totally overwhelmed. There's a million possibilities for how this intensity can rise up and motivate us forward to believe the lies from our previous experience and then walk out and answer. And of course, the result of these feelings is we can feel literally like we're going to die. And even the body can manifest feelings of like, I'm going to die if I don't do this thing. And I use that language because a lot of this takes place in the limbic system, which is the survival system of the brain. We're going to talk about that in a second when we get to mind. But it's that sense in our body. Our body goes, dude, you're going to die. It's like drowning, or better yet, like dying of dehydration, right? Dying of thirst. I've got to have the thing. I've got to have the thing. And that's what we're experiencing in the body. Now, a lot of people, I'm gonna just be real honest. I mean, with the way that we interact with sexual sin, particularly with like pornography or something that's really easily accessible, we get to the point of acting out way before we experience that intensity of thirst. And I just want to note that, like, some of that, like, you'll have to really resist, really resist to get to the point where you're going to feel like I'm truly going to die if I don't get this thing. So that's the process we go through in the body. And it's important to note that the body continues these signals. Even if we shift the mind, we'll talk about that, if we shift the mind, the body is still going to have this process built into it. And a lot of what I do is help men and encourage men and work with men to develop systems to deny, but be aware and deny and respond to the body and what the body is telling them. And that is just a wonderful thing, because we can start to take control of that bodily reaction that we're having and bring peace and calm to our systems. So as I was saying a minute ago, so trauma kind of bridges the body and the mind. And for just a simple baseline explanation of what trauma is something that happens to you that you are unable to adapt to emotionally and categorize properly. Okay. I like to call trauma confusion, because it creates a break in understanding in our brain. But that break is categorized as danger, right? And so we develop survival processes out of that trauma. We could say so much more about that. We're going to leave it there for now. But trauma bridges the body and the mind, because the mind, which has these pre-programmed survival instincts, pushes them onto the body. And the truth is, this connection can actually manifest experiences that like aren't in reality at all. They're not coming from out there. They're coming from in here and manifesting a different embodiment for ourselves. Crazy stuff. So let's talk about the mind a little bit. So the body participates in all of these feelings and experiences and all that stuff, and trauma kind of lives in the body. Our experience of trauma is in the body. But the mind also participates in sexual sin. How does it? Well, again, sexual addiction is not about sex. It's about how we cope with life as we perceive it in our mind. Now, that's really important. The fact that we perceive life a certain way, and then that's what we're responding to with our medication. Our mind has learned how to steer us back to solutions, or namely our addiction. And over time, our life gets wrapped around this. I want you to think of your mind like a system of loops, okay? And for the most part, we don't choose almost anything that we do. Like all these hand gestures I'm making and stuff, I'm not choosing all this stuff. I'm not choosing to breathe right now or beat my heart or all that stuff. Our mind does a ton of work without us, or without our active participation in it. And so in some ways, our mind is simply calling up a looped response, right, for us to follow as we're going about our day for a million and one different reasons. And so what ends up happening is the mind becomes structured in such a way as to depend in loops on this medication. Now, those loops are can be, I mean, they can be used for a million different things, but are generally rooted in, again, that fear that we have. So the mind, in reaction to the fear, goes, okay, we need a solution for that. Solution number 101, boop, preload, and then it runs out the process. And the only thing that can really fight against this is coming back to our right mind and retaking and actively taking a stance against these loops. The thing I really want to note here is that the mind learns all sorts of things that you may not even think about. I remember hearing this great term years ago, early in my recovery. The term is seemingly unimportant decisions. So let me give you this little example of what the mind can do. Let's say that you're a hardworking guy and you go to work. You have a 9 to 5. You come home from work, and then you, generally speaking, you go take a shower, then you make dinner, then you grab your phone, scroll for a while, you act out, right? And by act out, I mean you use your medication of sexual sin, whatever form that is. Generally in porn's easy because it's very accessible. We could just use that. So what has the mind learned? The mind hasn't just learned that it likes porn. It's learned that porn comes after scrolling on the phone, eating food, showering, and coming home from work. It learns these whole cycles of behavior. And then when it needs, say you get that trigger of fear, it's going to, boom, run the process, right? And we get this interesting addiction matrix where we go in these circles and these loops. And those loops are actually, man, it scared me how predictable they were. It scared me how I could just watch myself drive off a cliff and into this thing that I didn't want to do again. Now, those loops are combinations of both behaviors and thoughts or whatever, but the mind remembers them and learns them and develops stronger bonds. You may have heard this before. Synapses that fire together, wire together. This idea that when we do things next to one another, it creates a stronger bond between them in our mind. Okay, or neurons that fire together, wire together. So it creates a stronger bond in our mind, and that bond is what you might call a rut we can get into that we just follow, like a well-worn path. And that's what our mind is doing. That's how our mind is participating. Our mind is also the place where we experience all of the emotions and such that are going on with this process. So when we talk about things like calming down, that has a very real presence in the mind. We talk about freaking out, has a very real presence in the mind. And all of that. The mind is also the place where we're able to take charge over ourselves and really understand ourselves. A little distracted here. The mind is the place where we get to take control of our addiction. It's where we get to get ahead of our addiction by breaking those cycles. And once we can understand the background processes of the mind, we can get in between. Okay. So much more to say there. I'm going to leave it be for now. Now, the spirit is a little bit harder to talk about. And I don't know where you're at with, with your faith or how much you know about this stuff or that sort of thing. But the soul is a very real part of the process of addiction recovery. As a matter of fact, without the spiritual component of recovery, and this is what I think Christianity has, that so many programs just don't even touch, and it's a shame. But the Christian recognizes that the spirit inside of us, that which is made in the image of God and connects with God and is submitted to God, that needs to be healed as well. And that needs to be restored as well. And the question is, what happens to the spirit as it participates in sexual sin? Well, sin creates separation. So in some very real sense, sexual sin creates a separation from God, and we feel homeless. I like the term homeless because God, our spirit getting close to God is a lot like coming home. Kind of like the parable of the prodigal son, right? It's that loving embrace by God that we cannot experience without healing up our spirit. I've known many men who have fixed their behavior, they've stopped doing the thing, and yet they still are living a half life, a shell of a life, a secondary existence, a non-kingdom kind of existence, because they're still experiencing that separation paradigm with God. Now, there's another paradigm for the spirit, which is what I'm calling the marriage unity paradigm. And that's, you remember when Paul admonishes us, he says, hey, don't sleep with prostitutes, because don't you know when you sleep with prostitutes, you're binding the spirit of God to them, to their spirit? It's this marriage unity paradigm. The idea that a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, the two will become one flesh. That is disrupted in our spirit when we act out sexually. It's a different kind of separation. It's a earthly grace that we've been separated from. It also operationally gets in between us and our spouse. Without our spirits being uh, intertwined, without them being rightly aligned with one another, there's just all this spiritual conflict that's involved in that. Um, more on that some other time. And then there's another one which I think you'll very much relate to. There's the seared conscience paradigm. So our spirit is the place that convicts us. It's the who we really are, and the conscience in some sense exists there. Now, our concepts of our spirit, a lot of times we're like, oh, it's kind of like our heart or something like that. But the truth is, we know that our spirit resides in some very real sense in our mind. It's who we are. And I think the spirit is compositely, or not compositely, is connected to, dynamically to all parts of us. So it's not exactly like extractable, right? That being said, the conscience is a part of the spirit in the sense that it is what convicts us unto the morality that is embedded on our soul by God. We could go on that a minute. Here's my point. When we act out sexually and when we participate in this over a long period of time, our connection with that common grace of God's morality deteriorates in our spirit. And we begin to sear our conscience so that we can no longer determine what is right and wrong. So if you've been acting out for very long, you know that at some point you kind of stop feeling bad about it. You really, really do. And one of the things I love doing with men is helping them remember how vital this is. Because as we sear the conscience, as we become less able to recognize what is right and wrong, we also forget what the experience of that right is, what the blessedness of that right is, what the goodness that can be achieved is, and those things become like a bizarre side note, everybody in this Christianity thing just kind of they kind of talk about that, but it's not really real. It's like, oh, these are the fancy words we use to maybe describe God, but I can't actually have that kind of an experience. It's not true. And a lot of times, and here's a big one for you guys. Put this one on your wall. Addiction recovery is far more often about removing strongholds than it is building castles. It's about getting things out of God's way more than it is about like building new systems of engagement with God. Although I'm going to be very clear, you absolutely must engage with God, with his spirit. You absolutely must. I don't want to downplay that. What I do want to say, though, is that most of us just have tons of stuff in our way that's keeping us from God. The seared conscience is one of them that develops strongholds, strong things in our way to be able to see what God has for us. So our body, mind, and our spirit all end up participating in this in this paradigm, and it's terribly destructive. And I think what's interesting is that for a lot of people it ends at numbness, just like me. It ends up being numb. The reason that's important is because I have learned that what numbness actually is pain so great you can't feel it. Now what I mean is this: if you ask somebody what it feels like to be numb, the most common kind of parallel words they'll use are things like overwhelming, right? You can think about it like there's just so much happening that I can't even register the bits and pieces of this emotion or this feeling that I'm actually having. I'm just beyond my capacity to address these things. So, um, yeah. So when the body, mind, and the spirit, and they're all wrapped up in this, we end up at this complete and utter overwhelm. And that is why we operate from the limbic system. All right, I'm going to go back to the mind for just a second and move on. So the limbic system is the survival part of the brain. And we don't have time to go into all the stuff, but basically think of it this way. You've got your right mind, and you've got your limbic system. You've got your prefrontal cortex, the thing that thinks, and you've got your limbic system, which controls automated processes and that sort of thing. A lot more to that. When we become overwhelmed, we feel as though we are in danger. When we feel as though we're in danger, the limbic system overrides our better reasoning. It just takes over. And it goes, hey, we got to do this thing or we're going to die. We're going to die. Okay, it's that feeling of going to die again. And then we go down a path. And this is essentially what addiction is. Addiction is when you are to the point where your limbic system turns on and takes you to an unhealthy coping mechanism. And you do that thing because it compels you to that thing. There are other ways to define it, but this is a fundamental in recovery, that we understand that we're giving over our mind to our survival processes, which have been programmed in the past to dictate what we're going to do in the future. I hope that makes sense. I hope that all made sense. Okay. Now, so there's kind of like this general paradigm. If you have any questions, please comment and all that stuff. And also, if you can like and subscribe, if you want to see this kind of content more and more, please help me out by liking and subscribing to the channel and all that stuff. All right. So let's move on to some starting points, because I want to make sure that we don't just leave here without giving some moving points. So some starting points against sexual addiction. First off, it's really important that you recognize that addiction recovery is not about getting rid of pain. As a matter of fact, it's about adopting a healthy relationship with pain. Pain, this is known across the board with addiction recovery. Pain is required. We are not going to get out of our addiction comfortably. Okay? Now, why, right? Let's talk about the difference between healthy pain and unhealthy pain. In my opinion, there's essentially two kinds of pain. There's the pain of consequence, which is the reality that comes from our bad behaviors or people's bad behaviors towards us or whatever, the pain of consequence. And then there's the pain of conviction. The pain of consequence is from the outside. The pain of conviction is from the inside. The pain of consequence is intense and can manifest a lot of change in us, particularly if something happens like what happened to me, where all of a sudden everybody knows what you've done, and it's super embarrassing and painful, and you're just bearing the weight of what you've done. Matter of fact, in 2 Corinthians, Paul encourages us to go to those people and comfort them, lest they be overcome with excessive sorrow. Overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. He says, the punishment by the majority is enough. I love that phrase. What a great phrase. That is exactly what I experienced. The punishment by the majority. Everybody knows, and that is punishment enough because of all the conviction that rises up inside. Okay. So the thing is, the pain of consequence will come and go. It'll come and go. Now, you may have ongoing consequences that continue to create pain. But the pain of conviction is something that we must develop and well up inside of us, so that when we see a problem in our life, when we see that something's off and wrong, instead of running from that pain, in other words, going to our limbic system, switching systems, and letting our body just run and go get medication, instead of doing that, we walk towards our pain. We get a hold of it and we use it. It's useful for overcoming our addiction. We say, that's wrong, but I'm right with God. Let's go fix this for him. And that's a huge step in the right direction. Another starting point, like if you're looking for a time to really get rolling on this, I want to encourage you, if you're acting out regularly, if this is something that you're participating in, and you've got an addiction, I want to encourage you that after you relapse, you have a window of clarity after that. At least most people do. After we fall, we have the opportunity to see our condition for what it really is. And what's crazy about that is, after that little window of clarity, then comes back in all the denial and stuff, all the things that cover that back over. And obviously, I didn't frame up denial today. We can talk, oh my gosh, we can talk about denial and justifications and all these things. They're a big deal. But I want to point out that most of the time, addicts don't think clearly. Why? Because they're always trying to get back to their medication. Now, I say that meaning this: you don't always feel like you're chasing your medication, but because the mind learns in loops like that, it's wrapped your life around getting to that medication. And so even if you don't mean to, or even if you're doing very good things, the brain is twisting that into getting you to that medication in the end. So if you relapse, I want to encourage you after that relapse to engage and figure out, check. Oh man, I hope y'all can hear me. I just realized my mic might not be working. Ooh, okay. You can yes, you can engage and figure out what's actually going on with you in that little bit of clarity after a relapse. It's a wonderful time to create understanding. Okay, the last area, the last kind of starting point I want to talk about, or the last piece of this pain piece, is that there's clarity in the exposure to truth. So if you don't want to use a relapse to get clarity, which I really don't encourage in general, but it is useful if it happens, you can think about getting clarity in exposure to truth. When we expose ourselves to the Word of God, when we engage with God's beauty, we have a chance to see the distance between ourselves and the holy, and that creates a level of conviction. Just like my little story where God descended on me, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, that's a big deal. And that became a poignant moment for me. It's a motivating moment to keep me out of sin. Okay. Yes. So that exposure to the truth can create in us that well and that little bit of conviction that we need. And if we buddy up to that conviction, we can start to create real change in our lives. Well, folks, the problem with this live stream is that we are 45 minutes in, and I got some Q&A that I want to do. I'm going to have to get to, there's a few things we didn't get to, some healing foundations, which, man, I really want to get to, and we'll do that next time for sure. Also wanted to walk through kind of a classic scenario with some suggestions. Let me hit those real quick for you so that you do have some places to go from here. If you're struggling with all of this and your brain is taking over and and you feel like it's forcing you to go to places that you do not want to go, and you want to route this, here's my suggestion to you: 4 basic pieces. 1, I want to encourage you to engage in a discovery process. Give somebody a call, give a professional a call, or a pastor a call, somebody a call, and start bringing up those things that are actually a problem. Call them a problem. Call them a problem. Don't let your brain act in denial anymore. That process is something that I do. You can give me a call. We'll walk through it. We'll create a plan for what it would look like to heal. Second thing I would encourage is a counseling relationship. That counseling relationship would be with somebody who knows what they're doing. Okay, there's a lot of great counselors out there, Christian counselors. You might want to look for a CSAT, a certified sexual addiction therapist, or somebody that has a certification from the American Association of Sexual Addiction Therapists. You might look for that stuff. But anyone who can start to engage with you to root out the lies and engage with staying in your right mind and all of that is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I encourage you to do that. The third thing, and I really, this is huge. I want to encourage you to get into a support community of some kind. And this, I mean, in two parts. One, you need a really great friend who will just love you. You need one of those. Okay. That person provides a backbone to against your sense of shame. And then a support community along with that. Maybe that person is a part of your support community. That's totally fine. But you need a support community too, a place where you go and you workshop against this thing with other people. You hear other people's stories, and iron sharpens iron in that case. What this person says affects what you think, and what you think affects what that person says. And you get to talk about yourselves, and in listening and developing, you get to just grow and kind of have those moments of revelation with exposure to truth as it came from these people. So those two kinds of community, a great friend that'll love you and a support community. And then lastly, I want to encourage you with this. Most people who try to get into addiction recovery are too busy for it. And I just want to encourage you to lean into simplifying your life. Now, when I say leading a simple life, I'm not actually talking about necessarily doing less. I'm not talking about that concept of like things. I'm talking about the concept of simplifying your goals and your aspirations and your dreams and this sort of thing. And man, I've got some great books on it, but Simple Faith by Chuck Swindoll is a good one. You could check into the chapters on simplicity and celebration of discipline by Richard Foster and this sort of thing. The point is, there's a spiritual discipline of simplicity. And that spiritual discipline will be really helpful in setting you up to succeed in the addiction recovery process. Okay, I got about 12 minutes left, and I'm going to jump into some Q&A here real quick. The first question is, I don't have the resources for this huge process. Can't I just heal on my own? Now, if you've been in a recovery community for very long, you know that healing on your own is very, very difficult. A classic response is, if you were going to heal on your own, don't you think you would have done it by now, right? I would just like to point out that the reality of what we're trying to do, we didn't get to talk about trauma too much tonight, but the reality of what we're trying to do is we're actually trying to recode the limbic system. And to do that, we have to have experiences that code those memories in our mind. Some of those experiences are going to be particularly relational, right? And we have to have experiences with other people in order to code something different, in order to write something different in our mind. Excuse me. So if we're talking about healing on our own, it's simply impossible to create some of those new memories without having people around. Now, I'm not saying that you can't become healthy without people, because I first off, I believe in the healing power of Christ, his ability to come in and do amazing things in our lives. I believe in the process of sanctification and a God who can release us from things. And if you spend right time with God, it's possible that you can do some of these things. What we're talking about, however, is how God wants you to do it. Note, God gave us the church for this purpose. He gave us the church to be encouragers to one another, to be in community, to heal one another, to pray for one another, to do all those things. So if we try to do this on our own, really what we're doing is rejecting the way God wants to do it, right? He wants to do it through our brothers and sisters in Christ. So it's kind of like, hey, God, I don't want to do it your way, but will you just heal me this other way? Just, God, you do it the way you don't want to do it. How about that? And that's not a great plan. Not a great plan for healing, to tell God that he got it wrong and he should do it this way. All right. So that's my answer to that one at this point. Also, I will just say that I get the desire to not come out of the shadows. I get it. I encourage you to read John 3, particularly verse 19 through like 23, I think it is, where it talks about stepping into the light, what the benefit of that is. It's hard to do. Okay, next question. Question 2. It says, what if I use porn to get going so my wife and I can have sex? Yeah, I mean that's a great question in a lot of ways. As a Christian, I have to say, pornography in and of itself, there's so many reasons why pornography is outside of the will of God. So many reasons. But I hear maybe a question under this that goes something like, I want to please my wife, or my wife wants to please me, maybe one of the two, and porn's the way to get there. Why can't I do that? Right? Well, and here's where I'll go with this. So the truth is, the porn is what's creating the problem. It exacerbates the problem, makes the problem worse. And so if you start to, we've already talked about binding prostitutes with God, and in some very real sense, you'd be doing that same thing with your spouse. But I also want to just point out that you're not going to get off of heroin by taking heroin. Okay, that's not the way to go with it. Now, what am I not saying? What I'm not saying is that you're going to be able to go cold turkey and this sort of thing. Here's what I am saying. The body needs a chance to heal. If you're in a position where you have to use pornography in order to get the feelings going, in order to be intimate with your wife, I just want to encourage you that your body will heal if you give it the time. I want to encourage you to go off of sexual activity for 90 days. Okay, there's a few biological resets that happen in that time. And I want you to do 90 days, no porn, no masturbation, no sexual encounters with your wife, no even very sexual petting or anything like that. Just, you can have intimate bonding moments. We can talk more about that. It's just like cuddling and togetherness and this sort of thing. Holding hands, being close, having good conversations, and developing that relationship. But leave all sexual activity, physical sexual activity, off the table, and let your mind learn what it is to be at the baseline again and reset its biological systems. If you do that, my let's say educated suspicion is that you will have the ability to be impacted by your wife again and her beauty, and you can delight in her again because you've cleaned out some of those systems on a biological level. Now, I know that there's all sorts of other reasons why we might use porn to do that, but I'll leave it at that answer for now. Maybe we'll do another one another time. Okay. Let's see. By the way, I feel for you there, because I know what it's like to be in a place where you can't seem to connect with another person. All right. It says, I have been trying really hard to spend extra time on my wife in bed. Why do I always feel like crap after we have sex? Yeah. Okay. I think you'd be surprised how many people feel like crap after sex. I'm going to give you a little bit from my story, and another time maybe we can do other answers. But in my case, what I realized was that when I was being intimate with my wife, I had been so active in my acting out and my addiction that when my wife and I were done having even good, healthy intimacy, or relatively good and healthy intimacy, I would feel like crap because I had so much shame just connected to being sexual. And so I felt like crap after sex just because it was sexual in nature and had nothing to do with her performance or my performance or how much we loved each other or anything like that, and everything to do with I had these things coded right next to one another. I'll also say, in my experience, that feeling bad after sex a lot of times has to do with the fact that we brought performance mentality into the bedroom, and when we're done, we start freaking out about whether or not we did any good. And I'm just being very honest there. Like, we start freaking out about that. We go back to an old system of thought instead of an intimacy system of thought. We go back to an old system. So I want to encourage you in that case to take extra time beforehand to center yourself. You say that you're spending extra time with your wife in bed, like you're extending that process and trying to be intimate. That's great. That's great. But spend time orienting yourself towards what's actually going on. You're just there to invest in her and be giving and be worshipful before God. And when you're done and things are lovely and over, um, uh, 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 just don't go back to that performance mentality. Don't start going, okay, like, oh man, did she like it? Like this sort of thing. Don't get in all that. Just be like, I served. That's a to me a very encouraging way to get behind it. Okay, I can do one more. I can do one more. Let's see which one I want to do here. Yeah, we'll end with this one. Yeah. This is good for people who might be launching. Um, so it says, you talk a lot about trauma. True. I grew up in a healthy home. I don't think I have any trauma. So what do I look for instead? So this is a great point. I've met many people who grew up in pretty darn healthy homes, and they don't have anything to point at and be like, when I was 8, this happened to me and that sort of thing. Now, trauma is more dynamic than that. And I will note that there's trauma from things like neglect and stuff like that. That doesn't have to be like a single instance. You've got some language for it is, you've got whacks, like big punches, and then you've got lacks, which are like neglect type things, or like big T trauma, like bam, or little T trauma, which is like a million tiny cuts over time. So, the trauma doesn't have to be necessarily defined in this really narrow lens. However, I will say that, let's say you did grow up in a healthy home and things were healthy, and generally speaking, like, there's no trauma there to speak of in the home. Well, I would encourage you to remember that the culture we live in right now is so far from biblical sexuality and so far from healthy sexuality that just existing in this culture is everything you need to develop these survival processes, or a medication kind of relationship with pornography or sexually acting out. So what do you look for instead? I would say you look for that which introduced you to solving your problems that way. And it may just be opportunity. I remember when I was 9-ish, me and a friend walked out behind the church we were going to, and there, hidden in the crook of a tree, was a porn magazine of some kind. I don't remember what kind it was, but we were like, oh my gosh, we're at church, man. And there it is, back behind there. And we looked at it a little bit. We took it to my dad, who was in the church. We handed it to him. He's like, oh. it was kind of funny. Anyway, the point is, that opportunity in and of itself, that is enough to create secrecy and enough to, what's the word I'm looking for? It's enough to start that process of solving your problems through that sort of a medication. I mean, my hormones are certainly all alight in that moment. And if you have moments like that as well, and there's some exposure, and it can be very easy to end up in a place where you're solving problems that way. So, okay, I hope that makes sense. Golly, I wish I got so much more to talk about. Skipped like 4 things and didn't get to all the Q&A. But hey, thank you for coming along with me today again. Like and subscribe if you like this material, if you find it edifying, if you find it lovely and good. I'm praying for you. I hope that this helps you along as kind of a launching point for getting into dealing with your sexual addiction. If you need anything, feel free to contact me. I'd be glad to answer any questions. Feel free to comment below and all that stuff. And I hope to talk to you guys again very soon. I'm going to be live next week as well. So once a week I'm doing this. We're going to be going back through this material every week, but it'll be different questions and stuff like that, and there will be different notes. I'm going to be developing this a little bit more. So if you have other thoughts or anything you think I should talk about, please put those down below as well. All right. In case you have forgotten, you're loved. See you later.